Hi, I would like to return to a story that I introduced several videos ago, and this is specifically the story of Adam, from the story from the book of Genesis, of Adam naming the different creatures, the different animals. I would like to return to this story and with the intent of exploring it a little bit further. And to do that, in fact, I would like to set it beside and juxtapose it with another story, also from the book of Genesis, chapter 11 in the book of Genesis. I believe the story of Adam comes in the second chapter. So this is a little bit later in the book of Genesis. And this is a story that may be familiar to many of you. It's the story of the Tower of Babel. And briefly, the story goes that these people on the earth, they came with the inspiration to build a tower because they had the idea that they might, by building the tower, that they could somehow ascend outside of the sphere of the earth and reach the sphere of the heavens. And so they kept building up this tower. And in the book of Genesis, the story goes that the Lord saw them. He came to visit their construction. He saw them building this tower, and he thought that it was some kind of pride on their behalf. And so the Lord looked unfavorably on the tower, and he toppled the tower, and he scattered the people. So the people had built this tower, and they were able to build such a tower because of their ability to communicate with one another. They shared a common language. We know this, it's very difficult to cooperate with anyone with whom we can't understand, for example. And so this was kind of a necessary condition for them to be able to achieve something of that magnitude. They spoke the same language. Now, when they were scattered, one thing the Lord did is he separated them into all the diverse languages upon the globe. We can see how this is in some way, again, a mythological picture. This is returning to a theme from the last video, the theme of the idea that myths somehow give us a way they provide some kind of insight into what confronts us, through our sight, through appearances. The myths, they offer a way for us to understand what it is that we're seeing. And so, one way to look at this myth is, it gives an explanation for why there is a diversity of languages on the earth. Incidentally, the notion of God coming and toppling down this tower, it might seem counterintuitive that God, who is ostensibly the sort of ultimate and primordial creator of the universe and sustainer of the universe, that a being like that would be so, how would one say, so capricious and so threatened by these people building a tower that basically on a whim God would just topple the tower. This is a question. It's related to a question called the problem of evil, sometimes called theodicy, and that's an entirely separate topic that I don't intend to treat in this video. Though, if you have interest, it's something we can explore over the next weeks we have together. I do just want to point out something that can help in some way reveal the nature of myth, using this as an example. What we're not given in a myth like this, or in any myth, in the Prometheus myth, we're also not given. We're not given a sort of view from nowhere on the situation. What we're given is a specific narrative told from the perspective of specific people. Right? And in some way, we can. There's a measurable change if somebody studies this. For example, if you take the Old Testament of the Bible, the perspective of the narrative, it's immeasurably changes throughout the work, and then in the New Testament too. The reason I bring that up is again not to jump ship and talk about a different subject, but only to point out the nature of that all stories, this is an essential quality of a myth or a story, is that it's told from one perspective, and that might sound like a limitation, but it doesn't have to be a limitation. It's only a limitation if we don't recognize it. The minute we recognize it for what it is, then it suddenly just becomes a new richness to the story itself. And that specific idea, it's in some way it expresses what I would also like to explore now that we have these two stories juxtaposed to one another. If we think about the idea of Adam naming the creatures, and then the idea that several chapters later, whatever names that Adam used, they're now kind of splintered and divided. No longer are they speaking the original language that Adam would have used to name the creatures, but now they're speaking a plurality, a diversity of tongues. And so then we might try to understand this and just think about it critically. And then we could make a differentiation between sort of Adam's speech and the speech of many different tribes and peoples. And then start to ask the question, what is the difference? And the fact that there are many names for something that we can call water, for example, acqua in Italian, agua in Spanish, Wasser in German, Vatten in Norwegian, etc. Many of you know more languages than I do, so. But the idea is in some ways, those are all different names for something. Now, is one of them correct? Is one of them right? What is the proper name for something? And I think these stories can give us some insight into how to think about that question. And if we imagine, because it might be tempting to say, well, the names are just arbitrary then. It's like you could call anything else, and just the names would be like sticky notes, almost like labels, and you just stick one name here, but you could switch them around and it would be just the same. That's a little bit misleading, though. That's not the whole story, because when we speak, we're not just speaking. In fact, by speech, we imply a kind of understanding, communication, so like an intelligibility. So with speaking, in some way, it's an incomplete speech if it's a speech that's not understood, right? And this is where speech itself implies conversation or dialogue. Because otherwise we would just call it noise, right? Or sound. We can make sounds. That's not the same thing as speech. Speech implies this kind of reciprocal back and forth communication. So it's clear that these names have to be understandable and intelligible. So then we see within a community, these names have to have some consistency. But then there's a second dimension to this, a deeper dimension that we can look at, which is, despite that there are 1,000 names for water, for example, or for any word, different languages are different languages because we call them different languages because they use different words for things, among other reasons. But nevertheless, and this is the important point that I really want to draw our attention to with these two stories, which is that so where is Adam's language in all of this? And I'm using Adam's language in the way that I described it before. Where is Adam's language? Is it lost? Is it just fractured amongst all the different groups? Or is it still in some ways present, but we have to know how to look for it? And that's what I want to suggest, which is that the fact that there's something there for us, the fact that something appears for us, that we're able to give a name to in the first place, like whatever we're recognizing, which we can then subsequently give more or less arbitrary names for. This is a way to understand this kind of original speech that is then fractured into after the Tower of Babel. So the Babel speech is kind of like the conventional names that we apply to things. But Adam's speech, which we could come up with other names for it, I'm using that name for consistency because of the specific context in these stories that I presented. Adam's speech, it's a speech that we, it's kind of like an interior speech in some way, in the sense that we're able to recognize, we live in a shared world, basically. We're able to recognize things and objects, common objects, common things, common ideas, that we can then give different names to. So the fact that there's such thing that we happen to call water, and somebody else happens to call aqua, and somebody else happens to call Wasser, the fact that there is such a thing as that, this I would say, if we can connect with that, that stratum of our experience, then we have some picture of how, well, in fact, what we have is a analogy to Plato's cave. Because we could imagine Plato's cave, we could just modify the image a little bit, and we could see that what we're beginning to do in understanding the nature of language and speech and naming through these two stories from Genesis, we're beginning to discover the manner in which the expression of something or the image of something relates to and corresponds to what it's an image of or what it's an expression of. And this is what I will suggest that we think about in terms of critical versus naive thinking, in fact. And this is again picking up on a topic from an earlier video, but the idea that we can sort of shuffle around the contents of things that have different labels, that doesn't imply that there's no such thing as truth, so to speak, or that the truth can't be known. There's no possibility for knowledge. In fact, and because again, if we call something one thing and then call it something different later, in some ways this is clearly, we're making a mistake, right? We're making an error, right? So if I'm talking about water, but if I say water, but I'm talking about something else, right? If I'm talking about an empty cup, for example, well, then it's clear that I've made an error. By that I mean in this technical way that my expression for something doesn't correspond with my meaning, right? And so I can use the word water, but if I'm not meaning water when I use that word, then it's a discrepancy, and it's a kind of error. Now again, we might say, we might come to the conclusion, jump to the conclusion. I would argue that that just means everything is kind of arbitrary, circumstantial. There's no logic to this. It's purely conventional. There's no logic beyond just conventional usage. The reason that it's convincing is because it's partly true. It's a half truth. It's not. I think it's not the whole truth, and the reason is because the fact that I could make that mistake, the fact of error, proves that there could be knowledge, proves that I could be not in error. In other words, that proves that I could speak the truth in this case and know the truth. Right. So rather than thinking of truth as something in some way outside or beyond us, in a way that often Plato's ideas are characterized as sort of out in some kind of transcendent heavenly realm. I think that might be that's a separate question than what I'm trying to point to here, which is I'm trying to point to the relation that is can be part of our experience, the relation between what our expression for something and the meaning that we're intending to express, and are those two things congruent and consistent? in prior weeks, we were approaching different dialogues of Plato. One of them being the Meno dialogue, and this in the Meno dialogue was an opportunity for us to consider the question, which is kind of a theme through all of Plato's dialogues, kind of Socratic irony, we could even call it, which is wisdom. Ignorance is the womb of wisdom, or it's like knowledge. Ignorance is like the soil out of which knowledge grows. Right? Ignorance gives birth to wisdom, and we see Socrates over and over again in many different ways reiterating that sentiment. Right? Like all philosophy begins in wonder. We can only learn something if we can't learn anything we think we already know, right? So this kind of not knowing, this unknowing, this ignorance, it's the condition for us to receive knowledge. If we think of ignorance as kind of the ground or the condition for knowledge, we could think of error as the proof of knowledge, or the fact that we can be wrong about something shows that we can be right about it too. And that's what I would like to introduce this picture of knowledge as the perception and understanding of the relation between a meaning or an object or a thing and the expression or the sign or the word or the name for that thing. It's the relation between a word and its meaning, right, or a sign and what it's a sign for. To again draw on this inexhaustible well of insight that Plato's cave can give us. We can imagine the relation between whatever is casting the shadows on that wall in the back, whatever is casting those shadows, and the shadows themselves. It's not a question of simply ignoring the shadows. It's rather what I'm suggesting as knowledge or understanding would be the perception of how the objects and the shadows relate to one another, right? And the whole constellation of things together. That I would call that intelligence, the capacity we have to understand those correlations between what is the expression of something and the thing that it's an expression of, between a word, a speech, and the meaning the speech is in some way conveying, right? And so to conclude, then if we think of intelligence as the ability that we have to understand things in that way that I tried to describe, what I would like to leave us with is this kind of open question that I hope we can pursue in the week to follow. Our theme for this week to come is artificial intelligence, and so what I wanted to pose this question of whether artificial intelligence is possible given this way. Can we really imagine an artificial intelligence? And that's something I don't mean to answer in this video. I don't mean to offer an answer. I mean to pose a question, and I hope it's something we can continue to explore and over the week to follow. So thank you for your time, and until next time, best wishes.